Smoke from the courtyard fills the vaulted hallway of the municipal library in Weimar in April 1945, smelling of damp ash and diesel exhaust. American soldiers move through the grand hall, clearing out administrative records and carrying wooden crates toward the bonfire burning outside. Standing near an oak bookshelf in the center of the room is Private Arthur Pendleton, age 22, holding an 18th-century leather manuscript against his chest like a fragile child. His squad leader points toward the open flames outside and orders him to throw the entire armful into the fire. Pendleton does not move. His knuckles turn white against the binding as he steps back against the wall and quietly refuses to destroy the pages. The work inside the hall stops instantly. Soldiers freeze with arms full of papers. Officers lower their clipboards, and Captain Douglas Hall turns slowly, his eyes wide as his hand hovers near his belt. In the doorway stands General George Patton, his 3 silver stars catching the dim light, his gaze locked on the private who disobeys a direct command. Patton does not speak, his face unreadable as the wind blows smoke across the marble floor. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal whether a commanding officer would enforce absolute military authority or preserve a piece of human heritage. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. Mud thickens the gravel drive of a quiet farmyard near Frankfurt in April 1945, where the air smells of damp pine and fresh manure. 17-year-old German horse groom Fritz Braun stands near the wooden stable doors, holding a leather riding bridle with brass buckles polished bright, despite the mud. General George Patton reaches for the stirrup, ready to mount a tall thoroughbred mare for a morning ride. Before his boot touches the iron, the young groom steps directly into his path, grabs the leather reins, and pulls the horse back. Braun looks at the 3 stars on the helmet, points down at the mare's swollen left hock tendon, and tells the general that riding her now will ruin her leg forever. Captain Paul Vance, commander of the escort detail, freezes on the wet gravel, his hand dropping to his holster as his eyes lock onto the teenage enemy civilian blocking a 3-star general. The military police along the perimeter fence stop talking, their hands tight against their rifles as they wait for the expected explosion. Patton stands motionless in the cold morning air, his leather riding crop resting against his thigh, his gaze fixed on the boy who had just challenged his authority. He does not yell, he does not order an arrest, and the silence across the open farmyard grows suffocating. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal whether a commanding general would enforce absolute military discipline or respect a horseman's quiet honesty. And the answer was not what anyone in that yard was prepared for. A mud-splattered farmyard outside Frankfurt in April 1945 holds the sharp tang of wet leather, manure, and cold rain. 17-year-old Fritz Braun stands in the center of the gravel lane, his bare hands tight on a leather riding bridle with brass buckles. A 3-star general reaches for the stirrup, intending to mount a sleek thoroughbred mare. The boy steps directly between the general and the horse, placing his small frame in front of the stirrup. He points down at the horse's left hind leg, where the hock tendon is swollen to the thickness of a man's wrist. The boy speaks, his voice thin against the damp air. "You cannot ride her," he says. "The leg is soft, and she will break before 2 miles. Captain Paul Vance, leading the general's armed escort, rests his hand instantly on the holster of his pistol. 3 armed soldiers freeze in place, their eyes shifting from the boy's frayed civilian coat to the ivory-handled revolvers at the general's belt. Nobody steps forward to pull the German teenager away. Nobody speaks. General Patton lowers his boot from the stirrup, his hand still resting on the pommel of the saddle. He looks down at the boy, then at the brass buckles on the bridle, then at the swelling above the mare's hoof. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal something fundamental about the man holding the reins of the Third Army, and the answer was not what anyone in that yard was prepared for. Picture the scene. It is 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a raw spring Tuesday. The light coming through the overcast sky is gray, thin, and entirely devoid of heat. The mud in the lane has frozen into sharp, jagged ruts that crack like ice under a heavy jackboot. In the center of the yard 4 men stand motionless around a bay horse. 2 mounted military policemen hold their carbines resting against their thighs, their horses breathing heavy white plumes into the cold air. Captain Paul Vance stands 3 paces to the left, his hand resting heavily on the flap of his leather holster, his eyes fixed on the teenager's face. In the background, the diesel engine of a command vehicle idles with a low, rhythmic thrum, vibrating through the wet earth. Nobody moves. Nobody makes a sound. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The officers present were watching a situation that violated every known protocol of military discipline in an occupied territory. They saw a 17-year-old local civilian actively interfering with a 3-star general commanding an army of hundreds of thousands of men, the staff officers, the escort commander, the guards who had spent years learning the unforgiving nature of military hierarchy. Every one of them was performing the same silent calculation. They were waiting for the sudden, furious reaction that usually followed any breach of authority. They expected an explosion of temper, an immediate arrest, or at the very least, a harsh directive to clear the road. They had watched Patton deal with far smaller infractions with ruthless severity across Sicily, France, and Germany. The room, or in this case the open air of a mud-soaked farmyard, froze while everyone waited for the heavy hand of military authority to fall on the teenage groom. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. Patton walked up to the mare's left leg, lowered his torso, and rested his fingers directly above the joint, pressing lightly against the tight tissue of the tendon. Not the way a general looks at an interruption, not the way a man looks at something that has irritated him. He looked at that horse the way a master craftsman looks at a fine tool that has been pushed past its tolerances. He did not yell. He did not remind anyone of his 3 stars or the army sitting on the road outside. He stood up, dusted off his riding gloves, and placed his palm squarely on the boy's shoulder. He said, with the quiet brevity that characterized everything he did when he wasn't performing, "Good eye, she stays." Captain Vance described the next 30 seconds as entirely motionless. Patton turned on his heel, walked past the escort officers, and climbed into the front passenger seat of his open-topped command vehicle. He did not offer a secondary order. He did not instruct his staff to replace the horse or punish the staff for taking an unfit animal. He simply took his seat, pulled his goggles down over his eyes, and waited for the column to move, see. What most folks don't realize is that Patton was not merely a soldier who happened to like horses. He was an Olympic modern pentathlete from the 1912 Stockholm Games, a rider who had spent his youth studying equestrian mechanics at the French cavalry school in Saumur. To Patton, a horse was not a piece of military property to be ordered around like a private. It was a delicate athletic engine governed by uncompromising physics. When Fritz Braun stepped in front of that saddle, he was not committing an act of wartime defiance. He was enforcing a law older than the Third Army, the law of biological limits. Patton recognized instantly that the boy was not acting out of fear, arrogance, or political hostility. He was acting out of pure, unadulterated horsemanship. In that singular moment, the rigid hierarchy of World War II vanished, replaced by an ancient code shared only by men who understand animals. Had Patton forced the mare into a trot, the swollen tendon would have snapped within 2 miles, ruining a thoroughbred permanently. The boy's refusal was not an insult to the army. It was a service to the animal. Patton saw a kid who possessed the one quality he valued above all others, the absolute refusal to compromise on basic professional standards, regardless of who was watching. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton, Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. Fritz Braun was 17 years old, born in the Rhine Valley, and he had spent his entire war tending to livestock on a farmyard near Frankfurt while empires burned around him. He did not look at the heavy brass buckles of the leather riding bridle hanging from his shoulder, nor did he look at the 3 polished silver stars shining on the helmet of the 3-star general standing 5 feet away. He simply planted his boots in the mud, grabbed the bit ring of the fine thoroughbred mare, and pushed General George S. Patton, Jr. clear away from the stirrup. The farmyard went dead silent in the specific way that open spaces go silent when an enlisted enemy youth lays hands on a commanding officer. Captain Paul Vance, the escort commander, felt his hand drop instinctively toward his holster, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nobody moved. The military police drivers frozen beside their running jeeps looked at the boy, then at the general, their postures rigid with the sudden, terrible realization of what they might have to witness. The boy stood his ground, resting one hand firmly on the mare's twitching neck and pointing with the other at the severe, swollen bulge stretching the hock tendon on the horse's rear left leg. Patton stopped. He did not shout, he did not reach for his sidearm, and he did not order the boy swept aside by the escort detail. He lowered his glance to the swollen joint, his eye fixing on the injury with absolute, motionless intensity. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether a 17-year-old groom was treated as an enemy combatant or something else entirely, and the answer was not what anyone in that farmyard was prepared for. 17-year-old Fritz Braun never returned to military service, nor did he ever leave the countryside surrounding Frankfurt. He spent 42 years after the fall of Berlin working as a head stableman for a private estate near Wiesbaden, tending to thoroughbreds, warmbloods, and farm horses until his retirement in 1987, when friends or curious historians would ask him in his later years about the day the American general entered his yard. He rarely spoke about high strategy, grand politics, or the downfall of the Reich. He would reach up to the wooden hook beside his tackle room door, run his worn fingers across the cracked oilcloth and polished brass buckles of a vintage German leather riding bridle, and explain that a good horseman always recognizes another horseman, regardless of the uniform they wear. The escort commander, Captain Paul Vance, survived the war and returned to his home state of Ohio, where he managed a commercial lumber business until the mid-1970s. In the letters he wrote home to his family in the autumn of 1945, Vance returned to those brief 30 seconds in the muddy German farmyard more than to any artillery barrage or tactical breakthrough he had witnessed across France. He recalled how the tension in the air melted away the moment Patton placed his hand on the young boy's shoulder, replacing the stark brutality of total war with an unspoken ancient understanding. For Vance, it was the single moment in his entire military service where the grand crushing machinery of World War II briefly paused, allowing two human beings from opposite sides of a global conflict to meet on common ground over the simple, unyielding care of an injured animal. Was Patton right to accept the groom's refusal and walk away without a word? Some would say that allowing a 17-year-old German farmhand to dictate terms to a commanding general risked undermining authority in a region still settling under military occupation. In a war zone, orders flow downward, and permitting an enemy civilian to check the movement of a high-ranking commander sets a dangerous precedent for discipline and control. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that true authority recognizes specialized competence, regardless of uniform, age, or rank. By respecting the groom's devotion to the animal, Patton demonstrated that professional standard outweighs ego, showing that the ultimate mark of leadership is knowing when to yield to someone who knows the truth of the situation. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.